Welcome back to another episode of Coffee Spills and Pineapples. My guest today is Micheline Aharonian Marcom, an American novelist of Armenian origin. Today we'll talk about literature, about writing, about the creativity behind putting words together, making them an inspirational prose, maybe a novel. How do you start all that? So before we talk about the writing process, maybe go back a few steps and talk about the importance of storytelling. Why is storytelling important, or is it important?
Well, I mean, I think it is. Storytelling is important. I think that the reasons I began to write and my earliest obsessions that brought me to writing have changed, or they're no longer what they were when I started in my 20s, when I wrote my first novel, Three Apples Fell from Heaven. At that time, I mean, I was young, and I think my biggest obsession was telling stories, or a story that hadn't been told. And not only hadn't been told, but had been denied, erased, elided, the story of the Armenian Genocide. Because I wrote that book in the 1990s. And then in English, in the United States, there was almost nothing, really, very little.
It was few. And there's a couple of other books happening at the same time also.
At the same time. I read Nancy Krikorian's book, Isabel, in Galley, when I was writing my book. And Peter's
Galakian,
Galakian, but that was a memoir. But so there was very little in English.
That's right.
And in the country I was raised in, no one knew what Armenians were, or that there had been a genocide. So that, to me, at the time, as a young writer, was a story that was so much bigger than me. It probably was the story that made me into a writer. I don't actually know that I would have become a writer.
I remember that book specifically because when it came out, it really made its waves in Canada. At least we heard about it, and we grabbed the first edition we could from the bookstores. And really till today it resonates with me, because it's very much about the characters that you've developed, and you really make them so real, so tangible, that they were living, and I was living with them. And I have to be honest with you, I had to take breaks from finishing that book. It was a quite hefty read. Very traumatic, I guess, or post-traumatic even to some extent, because it was sort of saying things that I wanted to say out loud. And it was a healing process for me, at least, reading that book. So yeah, I'm really honored to actually be here face to face with the person that wrote that novel, that really, for all of us, many of us, changed the way we talk about genocide, about our stories. So about the characters, how do you develop them?
I always say this to my students. I've been teaching in creative writing for more than 20 years now. I feel like the first book makes the writer, in a way. Like, book teaches you as much as you make it. It makes you as much as you make it. So it's a relationship, making a book. It takes years to write a novel. Usually that novel took 3 years, and there was a lot of work beforehand to even be able to come to the point of writing a book like that. And I didn't know what I was doing. And I still don't, so I'm pretty confident now that not knowing what I'm doing is how I work. I was just following often, initially, just a strong feeling, mostly a feeling that I needed to honor my grandmother's story. You know, that was a story that I was raised, actually not even really hearing. My grandparents were in Beirut, we were in Los Angeles. And, the war broke out there, 1974. So our family went through 2 wars, was separated again because of a war. And when I was very young, we would go and spend our summers with them. And then that relationship was cut off because of the war. So in a way, to some extent, then my grandfather immigrated to the U.S. and lived with us. My grandmother died. My grandmother was obsessed with telling stories of the genocide and how she survived with her brothers and sister. But in some ways, it was the stories that I didn't hear that was the reason I wrote the book. I always say, as the third generation, I inherited like 5 sentences from my mother, who talked about it. And, told me about it. And I sort of needed to fill in a world because I knew so little. And actually felt ashamed that I knew so little because I felt this strong, I had this heft inside of me, these strong feelings, I think, I would say now. Melancholy, sorrow, or something that I think Armenians
Grief,
generally,
probably, yes, also.
yeah, that wasn't processed in any way.
I think there's a whole generation that even refused to talk about it,
Yeah,
even
that's right.
refused to tell these stories. And we sort of, I remember in the 80s, 90s, we just started sort of taking them out of our grandparents and our parents, like, tell us these stories, tell us what really happened. So if we don't know these stories, we can't tell them. So it was very important that they would tell us firsthand stories that eventually turns into our stories from third, fourth generations and on.
Yeah. But there's so much that that is difficult to say, or simply cannot be spoken in a way that is healthy for that person. I think they don't speak many things. And so in some ways about the case of the Armenian genocide in that book, when I finally started writing it, and I thought I was writing one book, which was a story about my grandmother and potentially my grandfather. They were from adjacent towns. It became a very different book than the book I thought I was writing. If I would just write a story about her. And then I'm getting to this question you had about character, because as I was writing that book, as I realized I wanted to write about this book, and I didn't feel like I was up to the task. I mean, I was like, who am I to write this story? I don't speak Armenian. I had forgotten all of my Armenian by the time I was in my 20s. I was so far away from this place, etc. But I did because it was obsession or something, or duty.
It's inside of us for somehow also.
And it felt like duty. It was like, oh, I don't know if I can, but I have to try. That's my duty to my ancestors. But when I started writing the book, I thought I was going to write about my grandmother, and then I was doing at that point a master's in fine arts and literature, and so then studying with a teacher who was really extraordinary, who's still a friend of mine. She's from Mumbai, from India, and she introduced me to all these incredible books of world literature. And as I started reading all these other books, like the book aesthetically just completely opened up, and suddenly it felt like these characters were kind of showed up in my head as stories that I needed to tell. And partly from, I read when I was researching that book, I read everything in English I could find. So I read every memoir I could find, and from that tried to write these characters. But in the memoirs, as you probably know, many things are not said.
Are not said.
It's too shameful.
Yeah.
For example, what happens to women,
Right.
So I knew that was happening. I felt a duty to tell those stories, but it was my job as a writer several generations later, I think I had the freedom to do that. And that felt like that was part of my duty, to tell the stories.
Quite graphically.
And truly, for me, what felt like the truth, to access some level of the truth. I mean, the only thing I felt accountable to was the memory of my grandmother. I was like, yeah, people will probably not like me or not like this book or think it's too graphic or whatever people will say, but I felt the only person I was beholden to was my grandmother, her memory, and who she was and what she had survived. And so I think that, so whatever mistakes I made or whatever the book's failures are, like, those are mine.
Yeah, right.
And that's fine.
So coffee spills, those would be the coffee spills that So ideally, you evolved. You started teaching, but you were still writing. Yeah. And a lot of what you write is people displaced or living through a trauma, right? So that those seem to be like recurring themes. Why?
I think because I can. I mean, in some sense, I think I could. I don't know that I'm always going to or have always, but I've written about the Armenian case, and then I wrote about Lebanon and the second generation Beirut in my second novel. And I was thinking then about, the next generation and those who were orphaned and cut off. And then as a writer, I'm always thinking, what am I writing about? What am I taking up? But then aesthetically, formally, what's interesting to me? And so in that book, for example, whereas Three Apples was polyvocal, many voices, and the second book was one voice. I was like, that's interesting for me as a writer. I want to try to be in one voice, a male voice, and this particular story. But it was still about someone who had gone through, losing everything. And then when I did the third book, I think I knew I was writing a trilogy at some point. But the third book is quite different because a lot of the book is set in Guatemala. And I guess it just goes with these obsessions I had then. And I don't think I had them after I wrote those books exactly in the same way of writing. I wrote about the Guatemalan genocide and writing about people, again, who have no power during and actually afterwards to really tell their stories. And that was something that felt important to me, that as a writer, that's something that I can do and I wanted to do, and sort of writing into books what hasn't been written. I think at that time, especially, I would say I was very influenced by Toni Morrison.
But Guatemala, what took you to Guatemala from Armenia and Lebanon because of family attachments? What happened? Like, how did you end up discovering the Guatemalan genocide, and why talk about that one and not the Rwanda?
Right, good question. Partly chance, which was when I was in college. I was at Berkeley, and it was winter break, or I think it was winter break. And my boyfriend at the time, who became my husband, we wanted to go somewhere. We didn't have a lot of money. We're like, well, let's just go somewhere where the tickets are cheap. Let's go to Guatemala. The tickets are really cheap. I don't know. I've never been to Guatemala, but I speak Spanish. I had lived in Spain, and so I speak Spanish. And so we went to Guatemala for a few weeks. When we went to Guatemala that first time, I've been many times, it was at the very tail end of the Scorched Earth campaign, which I knew nothing about, when their dictator, Rios Montt is his name, went into the indigenous villages. It's a country that has many indigenous languages, and they carried out a genocide later was determined 4 groups of people. Anyway, I knew nothing then about it. Right. All I knew is I'm going with my boyfriend to Guatemala. We're traveling around like hippies. We had no money, but I spoke Spanish. And at one point we were way up somewhere on some trek of some kind, and we had a guide with us. And the guide took us out somewhere, like we're hiking in these caves or something.
In Guatemala.
We're in Guatemala, but we're out of the city now. We're in a remote area. We're hiking with a guide and other foreigners. And at some point he turns to me and he said, do you know that they've been killing people here? Something like that.
Really? Just randomly.
What? Because of so much oppression, then you couldn't speak publicly. But we were away. He was taking us on a trip.
Outside of the ears.
So he said something to me, and I was the only person who spoke Spanish in this group. Everyone was English speaking. He did. That's not the right sentence, but he said something like, "Bad things have been happening here." So what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. And then in another moment on that same trip, we were in a marketplace. There was an indigenous woman. She was seated selling her goods. And she said something that I remembered later. My memory is terrible, but something like, they came and took my husband and I never saw him again. Wow. Which very strangely was the exact sentence. It resonated because it was very similar to the sentence I had heard growing up about my great-grandmother who was taken at night by the gendarmes.
Of the Ottoman Empire.
Yes.
Yeah.
In the time of the genocide. So that stuck in my head.
Wow.
And years later, this is the weird thing about writing, is I didn't know what that book would be. I think I went back to Guatemala. A Spanish friend of mine was living there doing human rights work. And I went down there to visit her, again, to have fun in Guatemala. And suddenly my closest friend from Spain is doing human rights work. And I meet all these people in the human rights community. This was the time of the peace accords in the 90s. And suddenly I remembered that earlier trip and the things that...
sentence.
And so just like this, like it's very organic and strange. And then suddenly I'm like, I think I need to write about the Guatemalan genocide. But as a total outsider, I was a little conflicted about that, but I just was like, well, this is what was given to me, and I feel a duty to these people who I met all these years ago, and to other people I later interviewed.
If you're enjoying this episode, follow us on Spotify or subscribe to our YouTube channel. Are your writings always or almost always novels, right?
I'm a novelist, I would say. I've only written novels, except my last book was a collaboration with a visual artist of very small prose pieces and her paintings. Mostly I love the long form, but I also love the very long and the very short, but not short stories.
And how is that unique? Because you were talking about illustrations?
They're illuminations.
Illumination.
Hers are. We've done 2 books together. She's a friend of mine who's Afghan-American, so she was raised in Afghanistan till she was, I think, 7. And, she grew up with Eastern tradition and looking at illuminated books, the Persian ones especially, and the Indian. I love Armenian illuminated books. And one time I came to Armenia, this must have been 15 years ago. You know when you could get those beautiful books here?
Yeah.
The Russian books,
Right.
all the facsimiles of the Armenian, and I bought like 10 books. And
In Russian.
yeah, and Armenian.
But it was just pretty.
Home.
Yeah.
Yeah, but they had all these beautiful productions. And so I gave Fozia all these books. Look at these books of the Armenian Union. And I took photographs illegally. Also, they wouldn't let you then at Martin
The Marina Tavan.
here in Yerevan. I went in there. I took a bunch of illegal pictures. Sorry, don't tell him.
Yeah.
And I showed those all to Fozia.
I'm not going to tell any.
I was like, Fozia, let's do a book together. I wrote a book called The Brick House, and she illuminated it. And I said, but, for me, it wouldn't be meaningful if you look at these Armenian illuminated books and are inspired by them, even though there was nothing in the content that was Armenian, but it's just the tradition pulled the thread through a little bit.
More like the art form.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it syncs up with her as a visual artist, and she's a writer also.
So you've been trying new forms of storytelling besides the writing?
Besides novel writing,
yes. Tell us more about that.
Well, novel writing is very solitary and very lonely. And I only live in a very lonely, solitary country called the United States.
Not the first time I heard about the solitary
It's a very lonely
living in the States.
For me, it was mostly novel writing is very solitary. You're by yourself, hours on end, and it's not collaborative in any way. And suddenly I was like, I want to do something else, something collaborative, talking to other people more. And I had written a book called The New American, a novel, and I couldn't sell it. No one was interested in this. It's a story. It has nothing to do with Armenians. It's a story about an undocumented, in this case, Guatemalan American kid who gets deported.
Right.
And even though he's lived his whole life in the country, but this does happen, and it happened to someone I knew. And so he decides to make his way home illegally, and it's about his journey home. And to me, that seemed like an important story. No one at that time was talking about it. This is before Obama was president. This is before the kids were apprehended on the southern border in the United States. That was 2004.
Talking about walls and
all this stuff. So I wrote this book much before then. And people in New York are like, what? Southern border, blah, blah, blah. We don't care. No, I just couldn't.
Really?
People would buy this book or publish it. So I was like, okay, what do I do now? Well, I'll do something else. Because, writing, the life of a writer is a lot of no's. So you just have to figure something else out. So I was teaching a class. I lived in California, then working at a women's college, and I took my graduate students, it was men and women. I was like, we're going to go down into I had in my 20s worked in the inner city with kids who low income kids. And I was like, let's go down to do a storytelling class with these kids. Let them tell their own stories. And recently arrived immigrants. I knew the school, I had worked there myself. And so I thought that would be good. Let's do that. So I go down there, I take my graduate students.
This is in New York?
This is in California. Northern California, Oakland, actually. I take my graduate students, it's their community service. They only speak English. I'm translating into Spanish because all the kids are Spanish speaking. It was a class of, I think, 29 students of recently arrived immigrants to the United States. And then it turns out of those 29, 28 had recently arrived, and all of them were from Central America, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala. One kid was Mexican, and they were primarily undocumented children who had come without their parents and made a very treacherous journey to get to the United States.
Without their parents?
Yeah. Yes, this was happening quite a lot. Unaccompanied minors, they're called. So I had this idea, let's everybody tell your story. These are very traumatized kids. They could not tell their story to each other. They're teenagers, you're not going to talk about being beaten on the way or horse things. Right. So I was like, okay, this is a failure of a class. And it was. We did our best. We just tried to, have fun with the kids. But then we started hearing some stories and about how the kids made it, what was going on in their countries of origin.
How they started talking
privately. I started interviewing the children privately. In one-on-one. The microphone in the summer with a graduate student of mine began a project which is the New American Story Project, which is a digital oral history project. And then eventually we started working with attorneys and with kids who were gaining asylum for their cases. and trying to, again, tell a story. It's all a little bit similar.
But besides text, there's also audio.
And video.
Yeah.
And we moved away from, primarily I had been familiar with text and moved into doing video. So we were
Right.
kind of a documentary filmmaker who was in grad school.
When you write, you're the one holding the pen and writing, and you're the artist. And when you're doing collaborative work, let's say these videos, how do you position your voice? Like, what is your role? Because you're not behind the camera. How do you ensure that this is your piece?
The most important thing for me in this project, the first one we did, it was called Welcome Children, was the kids and their voices. So I never put my voice in. So we interviewed the children. Sometimes we videotaped them. Oftentimes we couldn't. We had to protect their identity, or we just
blur it or name.
And so I would work to edit the stories, but never ever adding in language or changing their language, just editing. So what I can bring to that is I know a story arc. I know what a story arc is. But then I realized, because I'm a novelist, the kids can tell an aspect of this story, but they're 15. They don't understand the historical context. They don't even understand the real push factors.
Right.
They don't understand immigration. They don't understand the U.S. So then we started interviewing all kinds of people. So we'd interview attorneys, journalists, human rights activists, historians.
To add context.
So it's like a mosaic. Right. That's a novel in my head. I know that. Hi. So it's a mosaic. It's like, here's these voices. And I knew it. I learned it in 3 apples. What's a novel? We got to have all these voices together and make a story. And that's, I think, what I contribute. So it's not my voice. It's the pattern that I help make.
I hear a little bit of passion in this video making process.
It's fun.
Yeah. So is that something you'd continue? You want to pursue a little bit more, or?
We did that project, and then I'm not very good at promoting these. I'm happy to make it. I don't know how to put it into the world, and I don't really like social media. I just don't want to do that. To me, it's not a very healthy place. So
this is going on social media, right?
Yeah, that's fine. I don't want to do it. It's like I don't care. I'm just kidding. Yes, of course. I don't want social. Yeah, it's not good for me.
But you have people promoting your
No, not really.
okay.
So right now, for example, we're finishing a project on Haiti. I haven't been very involved in the storytelling part. I've been involved in I found some funding, try to just, again, think of how can I contribute to the making of a pattern. Like, I think we need this and this and this. I'm going to interview some people when I get home. I would just want to make the videos and give them to humanitarian groups because they need help. They need help with good stories. I don't want them. I'm
sorry. So you're creating the content.
Yeah, to give to these humanitarian groups who are like no one knows about Haiti. Haiti is a nightmare right now.
Yeah, in Canada, we talk a lot about Haiti, I guess, because of the French language connection. In Montreal, this is, back in the 80s, we had many students in our classrooms that have just arrived, or
that's right.
Yeah,
that's
so
right.
there was there's like waves of Haitians that would immigrate just because that country is just a total mess. These are the things that cross my mind when we talk about the importance of storytelling, and why is it important to constantly put ourselves in the forefront, telling the human stories. Palestine, Ukraine, Israel, Russia, they all have stories to tell. So it's not what the mass media is telling us, which is black and white. There's real human stories behind all of this. And I think novel or audiovisual, it's important what you're doing. And it's important you're giving maybe the voice, you're allowing people to have a voice by telling their own story.
There's a lot of noise in the time we live in now. It's in the last however many years, at least 15, since with the rise of social media.
Yes, I totally agree.
In my mind, there's not a shortage of stories. There's just so many competing narratives. Human beings are story-making machines. We narrate everything. Everything is a narration in our heads. And some of those stories can be quite violent and venal and terrible. And I think we're telling a lot of those stories now. For myself, even trying to tease it out, there's a different, as a novelist, there's a way in which I thought a lot about a kind of integrity, I guess I would say, around a story. Or what Emerson Ralph Waldo Emerson said, telling the truth truly. And it's difficult because, to examine your own motivations and to try to we really have a kind of not just clarity, but an honesty or something at the deepest levels. And social media to me is a pretty toxic landscape.
A lot of things we've created as humans, we've created for the good, but we seem to use it for a lot of the bad as well.
Oh, we just haven't figured out how to use it yet.
People have figured it out and are using it to their benefit.
Yeah.
So some people have become billionaires and have memberships or followerships which are greater than countries. So the influence they would have on their followers or their members would be much greater than many of the countries that are in and around Europe. Very powerful, and they hold information, and I think that information makes them much stronger than any country that would not have information about their
They manipulate.
that other exactly.
And sometimes they think it's for the good, but it's like, do they? That's what they say. I just think, well, maybe you do, but that's how the road to hell is paved after all, with the good intention. So it's a complex time.
I wanted to talk a little bit about the process of sharing your knowledge. So as an instructor, as a teacher, you said 20 years? More.
Yeah.
So if you've been doing it for so many years, there's a liking to it. You're enjoying it. How come and why do you think it's good? Is it, if it is, and what benefits can you bring, or teaching or sharing knowledge can bring?
I mean, I've been a teacher longer than I've been a writer. I started when I lived in Spain in my 19. I lived there the first time. I started teaching English to make money. I needed to make some money. I lived there another time. I started teaching.
It's a great way to make money.
Yeah, teach English. So I did that, and so that's and then when I went back to the United States, I didn't have a job, and I got a job at a school, and then suddenly I was teaching English as a second language. And then eventually I became a writer. I studied writing, and I published a book, and so then I was a writer, and started teaching creative writing in my 30s. And I've been teaching creative writing, for 23 years now. So not every writer is a teacher, but I have been a teacher.
Yeah.
I'm a teacher and a writer. I love to teach. I love the classroom. I think it's a dynamic space. It can be dynamic and free at its best. Now, it's not always at its best, but that's the kind of environment I try to create, working with young artists, wanting to be in support of them becoming themselves as writers, it's a big journey. It was for me. It was just so life-changing. And I never tell another writer what to write, but I think that the arts have a very long history of apprenticeship. And along the way, if you're lucky, you get to apprentice with a few artists. And then for writers, the books are the teachers. And I say that to my students always. The books are the teachers, but you'll apprentice with me and I've been writing longer. Just like a painter apprentices with paintings, but if she's lucky, she might study with a painter for a few years, like Rembrandt. And actually so many of my friends have been my former students, there aren't that many people who love the word in the way that writers do. It's a very particular
There aren't
game.
many?
No,
Really?
not really, because it's not exactly storytelling. We all tell stories. That's a human thing. We are narrating machines, Who am I? What's my talent? Who are you? Me ask anybody. And it's a story.
Where do you come from?
Things in, bring it out. When you put in, what you put out. It's a story. You made decisions. But writing, the use of language to write is so different because, to write, to make books and reading itself is such a strange things that humans invented not even that long ago. Do you think about it? I mean, really only 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. But we've been telling stories a lot longer. I'm sure the minute we harnessed fire, and before then, we've been dancing and painting, telling stories, who knows how long, 70,000 years? But writing is very recent, and it's a different kind of art form. And the devotion and dedication to the written word, I think, is very particular. And probably a lot of people don't say that or even think about it.
More like formal writing is even newer,
Yeah.
like
I mean, like
yeah,
poetry.
yeah, for sure, yeah.
Highest form, let's say, although I love prose writing. For me to teach, we read a lot and I get to be with people for whom that is important.
Yes.
So, and it's joyful.
So speaking of the people, 20 some years, s- at least two generations, maybe the beginning of a third, is coming into your possession, into your environment, into your space. So you're working with a new generation of students um, who have a very completely different set of tools at their disposal, even as younger pupils. So now they arrive to you, and the artificial intelligence has to offer.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with that? Obviously, it can create, but it can plagiarize. It can mimic. Uh, so how do you help writers create in that environment?
The whole chat GPT is so new, right?
It is, of course, yeah.
So I haven't felt it yet. So my colleagues who teach on the other side of the aisle, who teach expository writing and teach literature, they are seeing it, right? They're just like, they have to be very careful. They're getting a lot, I think, and they're worried about like how people are going to use AI to write their essays and that sort of thing. For us, for prose writing, literary arts, it's not something that's been yet, but could be. I really don't know. Something that I think about very much yet, or certainly I don't worry about it because I don't know. It's like you don't become a writer. It's like saying I want to become a painter, but I'm going to have a machine do the painting for me. I mean, there's like that one artist who I do like he's working with AI to make art, and that's interesting. But it's not in lieu of oil painting.
I know a lot of universities have policies, and they're trying to make sure to be able to check
Yeah.
the works of the students and the plagiarism and so on. But my 13-year-old son was invited by his teacher to write just one short poem using certain words. And the teacher said, sure, use ChatGPT to create your poem. And that took him like maybe
5 seconds.
yeah, I wanted to say 2 minutes, but yeah, 10 seconds. What's the learning process for him? What did he learn? How did he engage with that piece? What are the emotions he put into it? And what kind of struggle or challenge did he have with choosing the word or the paraphrase and the poetry? So this is the concern that I have with what's coming up. But I figured maybe it's too soon for you to see it.
It's so far I haven't seen. I think I've heard one case though, so of someone who takes a class to take creative writing who then doesn't want to do it.
Yes, I see what you're saying.
Because it's like,
Yeah.
why? Then don't do it. Do something else. Because it's a creative class and it's self-expression. We are at a time of change.
We are.
We are at a time of massive change. It's very hard.
And very quick, I think. It's quite quick, yeah. And
looking around here on today thinking, everyone I'm looking at is looking into a phone. Me too, because I was lost. Everyone's looking into a phone. And I was thinking, Steve Jobs did this.
yeah.
One guy goes out and gets high and gets a vision about a telephone. I think that's the story.
Yeah, I think we give him too much credit. But yeah. The Steve Jobs of the world are doing this. Yes, of course.
A few people where I lived for 35 years in Silicon Valley, and I think he did have the idea for that telephone. I mean, however many people it was, or him or it wasn't, I just thought how much my life has changed and everyone's life here.
Sure.
And everywhere I go now.
Our generation is a little different. I mean, we're the Xers, so we went from really analog to switching the TV station, on the TV itself. We actually saw some of the black and white to color TVs.
And more in 1968.
And that took several years or like a decade or two for us to go into digital. Whereas now, as we're in digital, it's taking days or months for the speed of things technology to advance. And that's the scary part. Because, I mean, I don't know what my son's going to be in 5 years in university. It's not, I won't even recognize universities, maybe.
They're slow to adapt.
Yeah.
You can be assured.
But there's a lot of online universities now that are offering, online learning with the tools that are available, either through teleconferencing or even submitting papers.
You asked me why I like teaching.
Yeah.
And why I like teaching, and I taught in the pandemic online too.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I could figure out how to do it because, again, I think as apprenticeship, so I could exchange papers with students and it could be some meaningfulness there. But nothing replaces the classroom. I teach small seminars, 12 people around a table, and the kinds of energies that our bodies together, all the communication that happens, not just through language, but just the unspoken and the kind of thing that you can do together, that is not happening. And I never allow any screen ever in a room. I actually just
really
kind of go crazy. I even see their telephones. I'm like, and I say on my syllabus, no computers, no phones. Please take your phone outside. And the one difference I will say now is when I give them a break, immediately they'll go, I'm like, take it outside. No, it just freaks me out. I'm like, get it out of here because your attention is destroyed.
Right.
There's no attention. And I think that's the biggest issue of the time we're in. It wasn't me who said it. Other people said it. Is how will you keep your attention? How will you have it? And where will you put it?
I was also teaching at the university. I had marketing courses that I was teaching, and I did struggle with, if people were on the phone, I would just wait. I would just wait for them to and say, if you don't want to be here, you don't have to be. But when you're here, be with me because I also need the energy. I also need your energy. So if you don't give me your attention and your energy and your questions and your expressions, your facial expressions while I'm speaking, I feel like I'm speaking in the air, and that's really not interesting.
Because you are.
Yeah.
Because they're not there. The university was designed around dialogue. Which is across the logos, across the word, new things can happen, thinking together with the minds together. I went to this Buddhist talk the other day, and he talked about it, where I teach, everywhere in the United States now, depression rates among this age group, my son's age,
very high,
up 30%. And all the data points to the
social
button.
Media, yes.
And it's like, we know this as educators. We have to adapt. We have to teach them and help them. We're the adults still. What are we doing?
Totally agree.
I log into a classroom. I'm very strict. Then I always am steaming mad if I even see it, and they think I'm annoying. I'm like, I'm annoying.
Yeah.
I'm like, it's 1986. And
be annoyed. It's okay.
Colleague says it's 1986 in this room. Try it out.
Great year though.
I know. It's like such a good year. All the music was good.
Yeah, the music was good.
When I go into a big seminar where I teach, and I'll sit in the back. And the kids have their computers open. Most of them are on,
Yeah, something else. Yeah. It's not like they're taking notes.
And it's not like I didn't nap in college. I fell asleep all the time, but I wasn't shopping.
As our podcast is called Coffee Spills and Pineapples, so the coffee spills would be of things that didn't go your way.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember something that you had planned maybe and it just didn't happen? It didn't go your way, and well, we can call it failure. You learned something through the process, but it didn't work out.
My grad students to do this storytelling project, it was utter failure. It was bilingual. The kids are traumatized. My students were like, what are we doing here?
So if you were to do it again, how would you change that?
I probably wouldn't do it again, but what came out of that failure was the storytelling project. Or so many times in my life, especially as a writer, so many failures, or just people saying no, or applying for something, not getting it. For so many years, I adjuncted.
I hear you.
And I was underpaid for so many years, and I saw so many people get quote unquote good jobs, and I'd apply and not get it, and be including at the place I worked for 17 years, I never got a 10-year line job, and and I just over and over again, I was, you get upset, or however long that lasts, and then you're like, okay, you have to just pivot and keep going, because that's the only thing you can do. And I'd like to think that good things come from that, out of those failures. And I think it's true in writing too. Like, I learned so much from failing. That's where the learning is. And that's why I always tell my students, it's through failure that you learn. That's why you got to try everything and try hard and fail hard. That's where you really begin to figure out, what can language do? What can a book do? Yeah. Well, you can't do it if you don't get up to the edge of the possible. So failure is the great teacher. It's not like you remember, oh, I got an A.
To wrap it up, just to sort of give us a pineapple. Like, what's the crown jewel, the success, the thing that you carry with you and say, there's one thing that I did right.
The biggest thing I think I've done right, maybe, is not a material thing.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, some things have gone my way and some things haven't. But early on, writing Three Apples, even before I certainly didn't even have the confidence to do it, I trusted my intuition.
Mm.
And to this day, I get down and lots of things, like I said, everything doesn't go my way for sure, and I feel many things, not all of them happy, but I've always trusted my intuition as a writer. That's what I have, that very quiet internal place that the work comes from, and maybe other people don't like it, and that's it, but it's like, this is me on earth now.
Super.
And that books have taught me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for being with us today. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support us, follow us either on Spotify or subscribe on YouTube channel for more episodes from Coffee Spills and Pineapples.